Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this third week of Green Infrastructure and Sustainable Cities. And today we're going to talk about the way in which government, governance, and policy interacts to help structure investment in green infrastructure and where this actually might hinder it. So we'll be talking about the role of stakeholders today, the role of responsibility, and the way in which innovation or research and technology can be used to lead investment in GI. The main principles behind this week's lecture are the fact that we may understand what green infrastructure is in terms of its typologies or its principles, but the way in which these are delivered, the way in which these are presented and then set forward in policy and practice will differ across the world. And there are a number of review papers which build on last week's work to actually show how this occurs. So some things that we'll try and talk about this week are the way in which land can be reused, the way in which it can be rehabilitated, and the ways in which policy and practice can interact to assist this. And the fact that we always end up with a bit of a contestation or a dilemma between the economic viability of investment versus the socio-cultural benefits of GI, and of course the ecological benefits. So one thing that we'll talk about is the way in which different countries approach GI and the way in which GI fits within their different planning policies and planning scales. So in the UK, for those of you who have studied planning, you'll know that we have a very centralised system with national policy, and then nothing at the regions, and then local and city planning. And what this does, it provides scope for cities to think more broadly about how they interact and invest in GI, but it doesn't necessarily provide a structure where GI investments at a landscape scale can be fitted into a regional perspective. And this differs between countries. So in Germany, there's a much stronger regional body, so the Bundesländer, who actually have direct conversations with the national government, so to the federal government and the cities themselves and the different development institutes at a state level. So Germany has a far more fluid and interactive sort of form of discussion, and although they might be using green infrastructure terminology differently, the notions of landscape planning, environmental planning fit quite neatly within this, and areas such as the Ruhr, which has a history of landscape rehabilitation, has been at the forefront of some of these arguments. And then we have something like the United States, where there is a very, very focused, centralised set of policies presented by things like the Environmental Protection Agency, so the EPA. But then we start to end up with a far more complex and, in many ways, contradictory system of authorities and responsibilities as you move down from that federal level. So the states all have a Department of Environment, a Department of Natural Resources. You then have county and metro, so the big cities versus their periphery. Then you have local and neighbourhood sort of authority as well. And what this tends to mean for GI is that there's a far more complex set of negotiations or discussions between these different actors to try and enact on GI investment. And it can mean that policy which has federal or state support may not get ratified at the local level because they have powers of veto. So we'll talk about the way in which GI fits into these different structures and who the dominant advocates for GI are. It might be for GIR, it might be the government, it might be environmental organisations, it might be academics, and we'll go through some of these ideas, and we'll see how GI can fit into specific areas of this conversation. And we'll also talk about the way in which GI principles are developed or presented in policy and practice across the world. Pardon me. So the fact that there are a number of the key benefits that we might consider to be about green infrastructure, such as climate change, or the fact that they need to be funded, which might not be very prominent in some areas but might be prominent in others. So the notion of multifunctionality, or the notion of GI being an urban tool might be coming through here. And so again, there are lots of different angles to explore, and this does link to our discussions of advocates and stakeholders. So depending on who's leading these conversations, they might promote certain ideas over others, be it water management or sustainable development ideas. And so this gives you a snapshot of how areas such as the UK, the US, parts of Germany, parts of India or China and Australia might react to green infrastructure. And what this comes out with, and what we'll talk quite a lot about in the lecture, is different case studies. And we'll talk about things like the Garden Bridge, the High Line in New York, and then now the new Camden High Line, which are looking to invest in urban infrastructure and provide GI in very, very urban areas. However, the ramifications of this have been far-reaching. So there are ecological ramifications, there are social ramifications, and there are economic issues which need to be thought about. And in many ways, some of these projects are quite controversial. So the London Garden Bridge we'll talk about, and the way in which it led to quite a lot of backlash about the use of public money to provide what would have been in essence a public-private space, the way that the High Line might have restructured the economic profile of this part of Manhattan, and although it is a big tourist attraction, it is quite a strong linear GI feature. It might not be the most beneficial to the whole of the city, and the Camden High Line. So a very much a rip-off of the New York High Line, and the way in which they're trying to create this linear route between Camden and King's Cross. And all of these projects have quite clear discussions about the hierarchies of authority, about the responsibility from government, from private investors, from the environment sector and the public. And a lot of what we'll talk about tomorrow will be about these interactions. So how do these different components of society, how do these different actors in development and management of the landscape come together to either successfully manage the landscape for social betterment, or how does it sort of maneuver investment into certain areas at the detriment of others? So we will talk about who's involved, we will talk about the power and authority that these people have. We'll talk about the way in which this affects the scale of investment, so be it at a very localised scale or something much bigger. So we'll talk about business improvement districts and the way that they're promoting green infrastructure, and the fact that policy and practice has changed over time, so that actually you'll see sort of eras of GI investment, and it depends on the dominant political power or the financial situation at the time. Okay, so I'll see you all tomorrow morning, and I hope this is useful.